All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Terry Eichel. I am the director of the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network, and we are very excited to offer this webinar tonight called Can We Align Our Diets for Good Nutrition and Sustainability? It's such an important topic, and as I was just saying to our presenter, Dr. Boehm, before, food is something that is an integral part of every faith tradition and obviously life itself. So like we eat several times a day, but even from a faith perspective, it's something that we can think about as we incorporate food into our time with each other, into services and that sort of thing. It's definitely worth thinking about, considering, and implementing. I'm very excited about our presenter. Come on now, next slide. So we are the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network. This is also presented by Interfaith Power and Light, Connecticut. We are the Connecticut chapter for this national organization. And so this, I'm very excited. Dr. Rebecca Boehm is phenomenal, and she's with the Union of Concerned Scientists. So I'll just read her bio. She's an economist with the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. In her role, she conducts applied economic research to advance the development of a healthier, more sustainable, and equitable food system. Prior to joining UCS, Dr. Boehm was a postdoctoral fellow at the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity at the University of Connecticut, with a joint appointment in the UConn Agricultural and Resources Economics Department's ZWIC and for Food and Resource Policy. Her research has focused on understanding the implications of food choices for climate mitigation and adaptation, evaluating federal nutrition programs, including the Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Program, and assessing public health interventions to encourage healthy eating among children. Her research has been published in various journals, including Climate, Food Policy, Journal of Nutrition, Education Behavior, and Public Health Nutrition. Dr. Boehm has a BA in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Princeton University and a master's and PhD from the Tufts University Friedman School of Nutrition Science and the Agriculture, Food, and Environment Program. She has been quoted in the Chicago Tribune, Vice Munchies, the Washington Post, among other outlets. She is, I just went a little too soon. Our fun fact about her is she used to be a pastry chef in Boston, and she also enjoys biking and gardening. So I'm so excited to have her. Have her here with us. This is a topic that I've been interested in for a long time, and I've gotten a ton of feedback from our people that it's a topic they're interested in as well, especially from a climate mitigation standpoint and nutrition standpoint. This is something we can do ourselves. And so IREJN during the pandemic has obviously switched our Green Forum in-person events to online webinars. And so a lot of our webinars have focused on things that you can do at home or in a socially distanced manner to make a difference. And so you'll see some of our upcoming webinars are actually around different aspects of gardening, which would be very cool. We've done a lot with pollinator gardens this season that have been a really wonderful way for people to make a difference, planning, implementing, and planting pollinator gardens throughout Connecticut in ways that obviously are safe and socially distanced. So that's a little bit about us. And I'm now going to turn over the screen to our presenter, and you can get going. If you have questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A, and Dr. Boehm is going to give her presentation first, and then we'll do questions. So I will moderate those when we get to that point. So just drop them in the chat or the Q&A.
All right, just bear with me for just a second while I figure out how to share the right screen. Let's see. There's a way to do this with presenter mode. It's not letting me.
Can you share? Do you see the little green box?
Yeah, I clicked it and it's not, oh, let's see what this does. Allow Zoom to share your screen, yes. While I'm figuring that out, can people see my face or is it just the
Yes,
slide?
they can definitely see your face.
Okay, just making sure. Yeah, the screen share is not working. I even tested it. Oh, let's see. Okay, sure. I'm sorry, everyone.
It's okay.
Zoom will not be able to record the contents of your screen until it is quit. Well, that's not great. This is very strange. Let me try one more thing. Oh, there it is. Okay, now it's working.
Oh, good job. Okay, great.
Let's see. That was very weird.
Oh, yeah, I swear the motto of 2020 is let me share my screen.
Yeah.
Can anyone see this? Yeah.
All right. Then I can go, okay, you can see probably, let's see. No, that's not the one I want.
I'm going to go to slideshow from.
There we go. Okay. Perfect. And they can probably see your face, so I'm going to minimize that. All right, great. So yeah, thank you so much for having me, and for Teresa for being so relentless in getting me to do this. And I am really excited to talk to a Connecticut audience because as Teresa said in the introduction, I did my postdoc at UConn. I lived in West Hartford for 2 years, and so I'm very fond of the Quiet Corner. And so it's really good to be talking to people from Connecticut, and I miss it a lot. DC is wonderful, but Connecticut's a little cooler than DC in the summer. So I miss New England for the weather, and many other things. So yeah, my name is Rebecca Boehm. I'm the economist for the Food and Environment Program at Union of Concerned Scientists. I've been in this role for about 2 years. And I do various research, policy analysis on food and agriculture issues, which I'll get to in a little bit. But the main thrust of this presentation is going to be about my research, which is focused on the intersection of nutrition and environmental sustainability, as Teresa said in the introduction. And then I'm also, before I get to that, I'm going to talk about Union of Concerned Scientists and what we do and why it's related to this research that I have done in the past and continue to do, and also why it's sort of so relevant to the current situation we find ourselves in. So let's see. So Union of Concerned Scientists is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization. We are headquartered actually in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but we also have offices in Washington, D.C., where I work. Well, now from home. We also have offices in Oakland, California, and Chicago. And our bottom line is all about evidence-based policy. So whether we're talking about the climate or transportation or the food system, we want policymakers to use science in the best interest of the public and the environment to produce what we think is a healthy planet and a safer world. And so I think for me, having been in DC for the last 2 years, I've learned a lot about how science and evidence enters or does not enter into the policy process. And I've learned sort of what happens when special interests, ideological interests, or political interests take precedent over the public interest and when evidence isn't used to make policy. And so there's a lot of examples in history that I sort of wanted to go over that are relevant to the COVID pandemic, what we're kind of experiencing now, and also relevant to my research and the political side of how our diets are influenced. So this is a slide, a picture of faculty and students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1969. So these are the founders of the Union of Concerned Scientists. So we were actually founded on a protest of a bunch of academics who didn't like how their research in physics and nuclear energy was being used in war and used against people and people's public health, their interests in terms of public interest in public health. And so if you go to our website, you can read the letter that these faculty and students wrote to form the Union of Concerned Scientists back then. And so, you know, they were frustrated about the misuse of science in policymaking, which we see today. Another example that I recently learned about from watching the TV show Chernobyl on HBO, which I highly recommend, is Chernobyl. And as you'll see in that documentary, if you know about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, you know that politicians were influencing scientists and trying to cut scientists out of the process to address this public health crisis in Chernobyl. So we see it again and again. Union of Concerned Scientists saw it in '69, and that's why we're here today. And you'd think, over those years that this wouldn't be such a problem. And then we have this year, fast forward, a president who sort of falsified the track of a hurricane for I don't know what reason, and misuse essentially science, or put scientists in a very peculiar position to have to be in contradiction with him. And so here we are in 2019. We thought this was bad, and now we have the coronavirus, and we have again political influence over what scientists should be deciding and have a say in, and really be driving the policy decisions. So the question I asked earlier is what happens when you have special interests or ideological interests, when those trump evidence-based policy and the public interest. You get what we have right now, and you get some of these other things that have happened in the past. And I will say it happens in nutrition, in food and agriculture policy. So this is from 1980, kind of going backwards again. The Reagan administration, you may know, deemed ketchup as a vegetable for the National School Lunch Program, to sort of slide potatoes and French fries into children's lunches. And that actually, the ketchup or tomato as a vegetable came up again in 2011, where Congress was tried to limit how much tomato paste could be put into pizza, so that it couldn't count as a vegetable, or could count as a vegetable. So we see this obviously over time, the misuse of science or the ignoring of scientists when we're making policy, and that harms the public interest and the environment. And so Union of Concerned Scientists is really here to give voices to scientists in the policymaking space, and to give science a voice in Congress and in our government. And so that's where our program comes in. So this is just a snapshot from our website, the homepage. And so I'm part of the Food and Farms, or Food and Agriculture program, and you can see up at the top, we focus on climate and energy, transportation, nuclear weapons, which is how we got our start in 1969. And then also we've been doing a lot on science and democracy, because we see there's an intersection there between science and how democracy actually functions. So that's the overview of Union of Concerned Scientists. And as I alluded to earlier with the examples of ketchup as a vegetable, we see misuse of science in the policy making around food and agriculture, including, how what the government thinks is a healthy diet. And so I think this whole, what Union of Concerned Scientists does, this research that I'm going to present to you about your diet, are all interconnected, and it's both personal, and also there's a civic piece to it that I think you'll understand at the end, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. So I'm going to shift to talk about the research on sustainable diets, healthy and sustainable diets, which is the question that I posed in my title slide. So this chart is from a very high-profile study by a number of researchers, nutrition researchers, agronomists, and so on, showing sort of where we need to be to move different regions of the world to healthy diets. So you can see the 100, the dash bar is the optimal dietary pattern in terms of these different food groups. And you can see that we're way off in a lot of categories, especially red meat and starchy vegetables. So other food categories we're close to optimal intakes just in terms of nutrition. But you can see for various regions, including the United States and North America, that we need to shift away from certain foods just from a nutrition perspective. And so we have, and I will say we have a lot of good evidence on what a healthy diet is. It's plant-based, it's high in lean proteins, low in some of the proteins like red meat that have saturated fat. It has lots of nuts and seeds. Fish is also part of that. So we have a really good understanding of what is contained in a healthy diet. And as Teresa said in the introduction, I went to a nutrition school for part of my academic training, and no nutritionist will tell you to ever eliminate a food from your diet. We never say that. I think there's lots of different ways to eat a healthy diet. And it's about diversity, it's about moderation. And so I think, for the perspective of people in this audience, that it can be tailored to cultures and traditions very easily, because as we think about nutrition as nutrition scientists, we never want to eliminate anything necessarily from our diet. It's all about moderation and diversity. So I'll say that we know what a healthy diet is. It's flexible in some ways, and for lots of parts of the world, we need to change what we eat to get to that healthier diet. So that same study, Eat Lancet, also did an analysis of where we are globally in terms of the environmental impacts of our food choices. And so you can see at the top, they looked at various environmental indicators, so greenhouse gas emissions, cropland use, water use, nitrogen application. So if you're not familiar, nitrogen is a fertilizer used extensively in agricultural production, especially in grain production. It can volatilize and turn into a powerful greenhouse gas emission. Phosphorus and nitrogen are both used for fertilizers, and they can also pollute water. And then biodiversity loss. So of course, when we need agricultural land, we have to cut down forests in many cases. And so we lose biodiversity in that way, and also by fragmenting land. So they looked at these indicators and a number of scenarios compared to baseline diets. So you can see baseline diets here. I don't know, can you see my mouse circling, Teresa? Because this is a busy chart.
Yes, we can see it, yes.
Okay, great. So you can see the baseline here. So this is sort of the average global diet, and red on this chart indicates that we're over what they call planetary boundary of where we need to be for emissions, for phosphorus, and for biodiversity loss, and sort of approaching that or a little over that for nitrogen. And then they looked at shifts in diets. And also they looked at reducing food waste. So food waste is a big part of the issue in terms of sustainability in the food system. And so you can see, let's see, I'll take an example. Here, the fourth row down, you can see that if we make some shifts to agricultural production, we have food waste, but we keep our diets the way they are, we're still going to be over the planetary boundary for emissions per person. We're still going to be over for nitrogen and phosphorus. So you can see that even a big change like having food waste in the food system still wouldn't get us to where we need to be. And then in the very bottom row, so this production plus is representing a scenario in which agricultural production changes, so it's more sustainable. So you can imagine people can shift their diets, but also agricultural producers can do things that are better for the environment. And so, oops. So in this last scenario, it's a dietary shift to that healthy diet I showed you. So what if we all had that healthy diet? What if we halved food waste? And what if we had really substantial improvements in the sustainability of agricultural production? And we still see that we can be within planetary boundaries of these first three indicators, but we're still going to be in trouble with some other ones. And so I think with this analysis, now this was one study, it was criticized to some degree, but I think what this demonstrates and what they sort of concluded in this report was that this Eat-Lancet Commission concluded that global food systems, they can provide these win-win diets in terms of nutrition and sustainability, especially by 2050, but it will require a great food transformation. And I think this chart really demonstrates how challenging it's going to be to get people to shift their diets, to have food waste, and also to change agricultural production. So the challenge is very big. And this just summarizes sort of what I was saying before, and kind of goes over the results in a little more detail. So this study found that without changes in agriculture towards sustainability, we can simply reduce greenhouse gas emissions to within planetary bounds. So that's good news. We shift our diet to be healthier and we can lower emissions, but there's all these other environmental concerns that there's no improvement in. But with agricultural improvements, we can reduce emissions in our food system, we can reduce cropland use, water use, and impacts on biodiversity. So I think the finding here, or the takeaway message, is that yes, our diets are important, but we also need to be thinking about how agricultural producers do what they do, and how food gets processed and all the things in the food supply chain, and what their environmental impacts are. And we'll talk at the end in the Q&A actually about how you as an individual can potentially drive some of those changes in agricultural production. So now getting into some actual research that I have done. Actually, while I was at the University of Connecticut and also at Tufts, I did a big research project trying to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions from household food purchases, in the US. And so you can see here, you might be thinking, well, if you're an educated audience, this may not be that puzzling to you, but why should we care about emissions in the food system? There's emissions coming from transportation and industry and electricity use. So you can see here on this chart that food production actually accounts for 9% of US greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not an insubstantial share of our total economy's emissions. And then my study actually found that if we take all the emissions from the food system, so all the emissions embedded in the hamburger that you eat at McDonald's, or the vegetables that you buy at the grocery store that you make into dinner, that actually the emissions are 16% of our total US emissions. So again, they're substantial. And so thinking about how we can shift diets for health and also sustainability is really important, especially from a climate change perspective. So as the Eat-Lancet chart showed, the other thing we think about is not just sustainability, but nutrition. And there's a bunch of other factors we think about when we want to shift people's diets as a practitioner of nutrition. So the current US diet we know has too few fruits, vegetables, legumes, and whole grains. These are really the foundation of a healthy diet. We consume too much refined grains and added sugar. So that comes in soft drinks and sweets and things like that. And then we consume too much red and processed meat, which contains saturated fat and sodium and some other foods that are not so healthy for us. And in this diet, I took basically this current US diet in this research and said, what are the emissions being generated? Where do they come from in the food system? And is there a way that, are there certain households in the US who have lower profiles in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? So in that study, we found, as I said earlier, I sort of spoiled it, showing you the 16% slice of the pie, that emissions from the food system represent 16% of total US emissions. So on a per person or per household basis, adjusted for sort of average calories that people consume, I found that about every day or per week, an average adult in a household produces 72 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents. And that is 900 billion in total across the US. That's 900 billion kilograms of carbon dioxide per year. So again, this is substantial. It's not insignificant compared to, say, the car you're driving or your electricity use. And that's equivalent to 100 million passenger vehicle miles per year, to put that in perspective. And again, I said earlier, that's about 16% of total US emissions, and all this data was from 2013. And then another thing, just sort of for perspective, we looked at sort of just the total economic output of the food system, and we found that it's only 5%, a little over 5% of US gross domestic product. So that's a measure of total economic output, but the food system represents 16% of total emissions. So in a way, it's actually a very greenhouse gas intensive industry. And again, I think that indicates to me that there's an opportunity for consumers to shift what they're eating, both for health and for sustainability and climate reasons. And another thing that Teresa said in the introduction was that we make food choices every day. We make many food choices. And I think that's also an opportunity to think about how we can shift our diets as a way to, drive climate greenhouse gas emissions down. And in a way, our diets are very flexible. There's sort of a short lock-in period to them. We can make shifts within a week, whereas if we buy a house or a car, we're sort of locked into that for many years. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for systems change through consumer choices, but not just consumer choices, and we'll get to that towards the end. So just to break down those results a little bit more, we looked at where these emissions in the food system were being generated from US household food purchases. And we found that the majority were coming from industries that produce red meat, and the majority of emissions come from the production and manufacturing stages of the food supply chain. And that's not consistent across all food groups, as this chart shows. Some food groups, like fruits, vegetables, and melons, or fresh vegetables and melons, a lot of the emissions are actually generated after the food leaves the farm. So I think the story here is that we do know, and these results are consistent with other studies that have found that red meat in particular is very carbon intensive to produce. And that the majority of those emissions occur at the agricultural stage of the supply chain. So you can consider, how you would change your diet given these results. Maybe it means, even if culturally or traditionally red meat is an important part of your lifestyle, maybe it just means cutting out a couple servings. I'd like to talk about that in the Q&A. But again, no elimination. I want to stress that. The other thing I think this chart tells us is that for fresh vegetables and melons, a lot of the emissions are coming from after the food leaves the farm. And I think that presents an opportunity potentially for local food systems. So we know that a lot of fresh vegetables and fruits even, have to travel across the country in trucks. And those trucks require energy, more energy than just a regular truck without, cold storage. So the story is not necessarily about just eliminating certain foods, but it's also about like where you get your food and how it's produced. And then in a follow-up study, Teresa, how am I doing on time? I should ask that this moment.
You're in good shape.
Great, okay. So then in a follow-up study, we wanted to know, because we found this striking result about red meat, that what if people in the US households, or what's the greenhouse gas profile of households who purchase less red meat? Are their purchases going to be having the lowest total emissions per week? And so we use the same data, household food purchases, nationally represented, we'll see. And we also looked at the healthfulness. We looked at the emissions and the healthfulness of these food purchases. And so you see on the bottom here, we have quintiles. So we basically broke the households up into 5 groups based on how much red meat they purchased as a share of their total food budget. So if you spent $150 at the grocery store and you spent $20, we divided 20 by 150, and that gave us the share. And so we found that the healthfulness of diets, depending on the level of red meat that people purchased, it didn't vary very much across these red meat spending quintiles, because people make substitutions. So as an economist, we always think about substitutions and complementary goods. And so you can imagine that something that swaps out red meat may not be any healthier necessarily than the red meat. But we did find those households in the lowest quintile here, number 1, had really low emissions compared to all the other households. So those spending the smallest share of their budget on red meat had the lowest emissions. And there wasn't much difference in terms of emissions for these other households. And again, I think that is a story of substitution. So when you buy less red meat, you may be compensating and buying other things that, when added together, are actually just as carbon intensive as the red meat was. And so again, I think this speaks to the Eat Lancet findings, which say that, you know, we have to have dietary shifts, but we also have to have shifts in agricultural production. And then finally, some other research, and this looks like a very technical table, but I don't think it is. This is work that we just had published this year, work I did with colleagues at Tufts and the Union of Concerned Scientists, where we essentially did a review of research on sustainable diets in the developed world, so in higher income nations. And we compared these studies. We looked at the studies that were looking at the federally recommended diet. So what are the impacts in terms of climate and land use and these other environmental indicators. And then we looked at average US diets, and we wanted to see are these recommended diets from the federal government. So that's the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which you probably know as the food pyramid from the 90s and the My Plate from the 2000s. We wanted to know, is that diet more sustainable than what we're currently consuming? And so just to take the climate column, for example, so these are all the studies that were done in the US. So there's sort of a mixed bag for climate here, where some studies find a lower climate impact for this healthy recommended diet, and some studies are actually finding higher climate impact, so more greenhouse gas emissions if people shifted to a healthier diet recommended by our federal government. You can see that here we only have one data point, that if people switch to the healthier diet, that fertilizer use would increase, water pollution would go down. There's a lot of findings on water use, but it's mixed. So you have these arrows in parentheses. This sort of showing mixed findings depending on, sometimes the studies analyze multiple dietary patterns. So what we essentially found is that we're not sure that our federally recommended dietary pattern is sustainable and it's healthier and people don't eat it. Our current diet scores a big F if we grade it on an A to F scale compared to the federally recommended healthy diet. And now we have this concern about sustainability. I think what I believe, and this goes back to kind of what I started talking about Union of Concerned Scientists, is that research and evidence is crucial. And it's also crucial that it enters the policymaking process. So this chart is also from that same study we did this year. And you can see as early as 2003, there were very few studies on this topic of the sustainability and nutrition of US and global diets. And then it just kind of shot up after 2012. And the reason that happened was actually because the scientific committee who helps to formulate our federal dietary guidelines called for more research on this topic. And scientists listened and they said, okay, we'll do the research for you. And now we're currently in a new cycle of the dietary guidelines. And so now we have some of this research to inform this question about whether a healthy diet is compatible with a sustainable diet. And let's see, I'm gonna maybe skip this slide. Yeah, I'll skip this slide. So just thinking about the dietary guidelines for Americans, they are formulated every 5 years, and they drive what foods are included in our federal nutrition programs, including school lunches and SNAP, and the adequacy of those programs. And so there's a scientific committee who reviews all the nutrition evidence and says, here, USDA, the federal government, we've reviewed all the science for you, and this is what we think, based on science, people should be eating. And then USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services, so those executive branch political appointees and civil servants decide what the federal dietary guidelines should be. And in 2015, the scientific committee was strongly recommending the need to consider sustainability in our guidelines, especially because it's putting at risk, what we eat today is sort of putting at risk what we can eat in the future. And Congress intervened strongly and felt like, and this Heritage Foundation blog, I thought, really summarized what the response to that was. And many in Congress and other advocacy groups thought that environmental sustainability had nothing to do with nutrition, but we know that if we consume everything today, there's not going to be much left for the future. And so, in our mind and based on the science, it really does matter, because it's putting at risk the future offerings of the food system. And so you can see this kind of ties into this earlier theme I was talking about the misuse of science or the suppression of science in policymaking, or when policymakers don't listen to scientists. And in many cases, I think who wins in those cases are special interests or ideological interests, and not necessarily the public interest or the environment. And then fast forward to 2020. So after we did that, that study where we found that there's all this research, but the findings are mixed, which means we really need to include sustainability when we develop our dietary guidelines. We were so happy that we think that our work actually, including this study, helped to get sustainability into the new dietary guidelines report. So the scientists once again said sustainability must be considered. Now, we aren't necessarily hopeful that the political appointees will include sustainability when they issue the actual official federal dietary guidelines, but it's really important that the scientists ignored Congress and that political pressure and did the right thing and said, hey, sustainability is really important. It needs to be considered in this round of the dietary guidelines. But then we have the political piece of this. And so at UCS, we're always pushing for science to get in there because we think it's really in the best interest of people on the planet. And so we had a little win here, which we're happy about. So that concludes my presentation. I hope I was sort of on time, Teresa. And I'm looking forward to a rich discussion because I tried to make it a little spicy so that we could have a lot to talk about. So,
absolutely. No, thank you so much. That was, I turned off my video because people didn't need to watch me watching you, but I was nodding a lot. So folks, if you have questions, you want to drop them in the Q&A or the chat. I have to say, so how do we change agricultural production? How do we bring about that? Because I can see obviously that the impact of making different dietary choices, but how do we actually get folks to how do we get agricultural production to change? And is that like a legislative thing where we issue more environmental regulations, or is it sort of thing like transportation is obviously a huge piece of agriculture. Do we try and support local farms more,
I think so this is sort of what I was alluding to in the presentation, that as a consumer, you can sort of choose the types of foods that you want to eat. So raspberries versus cookies or chicken versus beef. Right. But you can obviously, I think increasingly, there's a market for attributes in foods that tell you something about how the food is produced. And so spending your money when you see those labels or you see those attributes is one way to, of course, drive change into the supply chain through demand. So that's like things like organic or fair trade certified. And I think there's been such a proliferation of those labeling systems that it is confusing for consumers. There is a concern about greenwashing and the potency of those programs. But I think there's still a lot of value in what a lot of those programs offer. I think the National Organic Program, which is where we get the organic seal, is a little success story because it was advocates who wanted this program to certify organic, and now it's $1 billion industry. So that's one way. And then the other way is through civic engagement, which is what we do at Union of Concerned Scientists. We have members, so you can be a member of Union of Concerned Scientists. You can go to our website and do that right now if you'd like. You can support our work, which we are trying to get the science on sustainable agriculture and sustainable diets into the policymaking process and help pass policies that give farmers support they need to transition to more sustainable practices, or in some cases that could be regulatory, regulating essentially what agriculture can do in terms of the environment, regulating industries that have a reputation for polluting and kind of lobbying the government to ignore the public health issues. So I think obviously voting, please vote. I know I imagine all of you are going to vote, but that's really important because our elected officials, they have a lot of power in driving legislation around agriculture, around nutrition. So that's really important. So I think that's the way that as an individual you can drive change in agriculture. And it's so kind of overall, I think to get to this healthier, sustainable food system, I think it's a mix of individual action and civic engagement and policy solutions that are changing the whole system.
And what does this look like for addressing food justice issues in lower income communities Someone just, Kelly was just writing, how can faith communities better support racial equity within the food system? Oh, Kelly, you read my mind. And build the capacity of organizations such as BCA Global, training people of color to be chefs, cooking with healthily and environmentally sustainable food. She said, this is something I'm working on with BCA Global and their Mindful Eating for the Beloved Community program. I believe Kelly's a Catholic. I think she might be Franciscan. But yeah, along this line, yeah, exactly. Because some of the things we mentioned, which I try to do myself, is supporting local farms, buying organic, and that sort of thing. But that's more expensive. Mm-hmm. And a lot of communities of color live in food deserts, and there just isn't the access, the choice. So how do we bring that change about?
I think so. As an economist, I give the non-nutrition answer, which is poverty. I think alleviating poverty and ensuring people have living beyond living wages, wages that allow them to purchase healthy foods, to have a lifestyle where they can cook. I don't think the issue with poor diets and food insecurity is all about money, though. It's also about time. I think poor households in the US are time constrained, and so it takes time to sort of forage or find the healthier foods or go to a local farm. And so for me, it's creating economic opportunities for people to live better lives. It's not just about nutrition education. That's a component. I think that's important, but I think it's a holistic shift in I think wages and even our healthcare provision. So I did some research where we found that the Medicaid expansion actually led to people purchasing less soda and sugary beverages. So I think when we have a strong social safety net, and when we provide living wages, I think that can help address issues like food insecurity or food deserts. So, it allows, education as well. I would say there's a lot of food marketing. This is something that the Rudd Center at UConn does a lot of work on. They find that food marketing is heavily, sort of despicably, heavily geared towards Black and brown children for junk food. And so education, so literacy and media is really essential to stop those habits, which start really early in life.
It's funny, in 2014, IREJN did a food justice sort of half day with several workshops, and we had a Rudd Center person. At that point, Rudd Center was still at Yale, I believe. Mm-hmm. And she came in and did a whole workshop on food marketing towards communities of color. And it was astonishing the amount of junk food and poor nutritious choices that was consciously being marketed at those communities and those kids. And it's horrifying, really. But Anne has a question. She says, many small farms have been replaced by big business farming companies. How is this affecting our sustainability?
That's a great question. I'm going to actually be doing some work on this question in the next year. So again, coming at this from an economic perspective, I think having a diversity of sizes of farms and food processing companies, and having essentially diversity in our food system is really a benefit, and that includes trade. So it's really, I think, beneficial for us to be able to have imported food, because it helps to smooth out food prices. When it's not in season in the US, we can import it. So diversity is really key, and there's downsides. There are absolutely downsides to some of these things, to large scale agricultural production. And I think besides, when we're thinking about grain production, so grain production in the US is very, it's gotten really large. Farming in general in the US has gotten large. So over time, we've lost farmers and we've increased the size of farms. And that's partly because of economies of scale. So the more you can operate 1,000 acres cheaper than 100 acres if you have to buy a big tractor. You know, if you bought the tractor, then do the 1,000 acres. So there's sort of natural economic forces that make it so that large scale agricultural production occurs. I think there's some benefits to that as well, lower food prices. But in terms of the ecology of places, when we have monocultures, that puts us at risk, especially with climate change. So if you have all the same crop in one area and it gets devastated by a flood, the farmer's revenue source is coming from one thing. So it's an economic risk. It's a ecological risk, despite these benefits that kind of agriculture has given us as consumers. And the other concerning thing I would say about, in terms of sustainability is I think people don't think about this enough, that when the food industry gets consolidated, so not necessarily agriculture, but food processing, for example, that concentration actually leads those businesses to lobby the government more because they have more at stake. And so they will put additional pressure on the government to relax regulations environmentally or for public health. And I think that's a real issue with concentration and large scale, the issue of scale in the food system, that it really increases the amount of lobbying that happens to our government and puts us all as consumers at risk, because those companies have a lot on the table.
Mm. So here's another question that is very timely, of course. So, Betsy says, I am referring to an article by Diana Urban in the Hartford Courant in March 2020. She said, one way to stop epidemics is to stop eating meat. Do you have any research on the crossover of viruses from animals to humans?
Like raw meat or like sort of wild. I'm assuming she means like human interactions with.
Yeah. Betsy, do you mean like via, because of course, oh wait, can I unmute her? Nope, cannot. How do I do that?
I think I can give one answer, which is I think the production of meat, red meat, requires grain for feed, and when you produce grain, you can cut down rainforest, and then there's more human interaction, I think, with potentially, I'm getting a little out of my expertise, but I do think when you lose biodiversity and you bring these monocultures that we see in agriculture, there is a risk for more human interactions with species that carry diseases. I think there's some evidence, and you have to confirm this, because again, I'm a little out of my wheelhouse, that that the palm oil plantations in certain parts of the world have actually increased interactions with humans and bats. So, and that is not necessarily a meat product, but that's a process that's used in a lot of processed foods. So, I'm not.
Yes, I know, and I know there's a attendee online who is probably nodding his head vigorously as we talk about palm oil and why we should avoid it, because it is a very damaging crop, and there are many much more sustainable options. But Rich Walser wants to know, would carbon fees help by discouraging the purchase of the most carbon intensive foods? So he's talking about the carbon fee and dividend plan. So would that help?
That's a good question. And actually a student who I worked with at UConn, we're working on a paper on how a carbon tax would affect emissions in the food system. And I think there's absolutely an opportunity for that to work. I think there's some trade-offs from an equity perspective. So I'm always careful in thinking through those. And then I always have this concern about substitution. So what are people swapping? Is there going to be a rebound effect potentially? Because people, when we know when prices go up, people switch to other foods in some cases. And so what are they going to switch to? How does that change their diet? So I think it should be considered a serious policy, a possibility policy-wise. There's not a lot of research, to my knowledge, on this topic, though, particularly from a food perspective.
From a food perspective.
Yeah.
So Betsy actually clarified her question about viruses from animals to human, and she said wet markets, crossover from agricultural animals to humans in wet markets. So is that, do we know?
I don't know anything about that. I know when the coronavirus in March, we were kind of doing research on the impacts to the food system, and we quickly found out that the virus can be in raw meat products, but the levels of active virus were potentially not concerning if you were to, say, touch a raw product and then touch your face. And then, of course, when you cook it, kills the virus, is my understanding. So yeah, and it doesn't last long on porous surfaces, and that I think includes meat products. Again, this is a little out of my expertise, but I hear the question, but that's as much as I know.
Right. Well, and I feel like in terms of viruses, it's something we're continuously learning about,
right?
Especially these days.
Yeah.
So Jean said, you mentioned the better diets include more fish, but aren't we overfishing the planet now?
Yeah, that's something that the Eat Lancet report got criticized heavily for, is not addressing the sustainability issues with respect to seafood and fish. So yes, she's absolutely right. And I think this is a tricky thing. Again, if we say, eat less red meat. What are people going to substitute? They might substitute fish. I mean, that sort of seems natural, that if you want an animal protein, you might make that switch. So absolutely, that's why this is really a tricky area. And I probably didn't give you the answers, like the silver bullet you wanted on like what you should eat, because it's complicated, and it's, there's interdependencies. So yeah, that is absolutely a problem. I think aquaculture can be part of the solution. I think sustainable, as long as it's, there's regulations or kind of frameworks around the pollution issue that can occur with aquaculture. And then, choosing seafood wisely and eating it in a sustainable quantity is really important.
Right. It's funny. One of the sort of ways that I deal with it personally, not that I'm an expert, but we eat a lot of vegetarian meals. And actually, IREJN has a section on our website with some really great vegetarian recipes. I actually think they're all vegan, believe it or not. One might have some cheese that you can remove if you don't like cheese. But basically, in my household, we eat a lot of vegetarian meals. And then when we do have an animal protein, we can go with like the sustainably fished fish or the locally grown, pasture raised beef. So, that's sort of how we get around that. I used to be like a vegetarian, fully vegetarian, for health reasons. And then I got married, and, my husband is not a vegetarian, and it's really hard to make multiple meals every single night. So we that's our compromise, is that we eat a lot of vegetarian meals, and there are a lot of beans in our life, and a lot of like multiple colors on the plate. But that's actually what something guides me, is that this was purely from a health perspective. Dr. David Servan-Schreiber was a cancer research and wrote a book called The Anti-Cancer Diet, and he basically said that animal protein should be the side dish, and the vegetables should be your main dish. And so, the 3 ounces of meat or animal protein was all you need, which is a very small amount. We're like completely in America sort of conditioned for like a 16-ounce steak, which is like 5 times the USDA recommended amount. So that is something that, and also the idea that you have to eat the rainbow. So you're just lots of different colors and textures on your plate.
Yeah,
But that's kind of how my family gets around it.
yeah, I like that. So economists call things like that like heuristics, rules of thumb. I like that. I like Michael Pollan has his own heuristic: eat foods, not too much, mostly plants, which I think is, if you need something simple, I think is not bad advice. In terms of health and even sustainability to a degree, because we do, as much as I was, saying there's some conflicts here in terms of what's healthy and sustainable, I think generally, a plant-based diet is much more sustainable, there's one other thing I was going to say. Oh, the other thing I was going to say was, well, actually it's not relevant. I'll hold it until it comes
Ooh,
up.
yeah, I have a couple of questions that just came up. This is from Pam. Due to COVID, NYC has suspended the collection of food composting by the Department of Sanitation. So this in itself is now negatively impacting the environment. Do you know how many cities do not have or do have a composting program?
I don't know. That's a great question, actually. I don't. I know DC has sort of an informal one at farmers markets, but like sort of institutionalized. I think they're increasing, but yeah, I don't. That's a great question. I'm gonna have to look that up, actually.
So in Connecticut, I'm going to put a plug in for this great composting service that you can get in the Hartford area. They may have expanded their region, but Blue Earth Compost is awesome. They are not expensive. They will come once a week or once every 2 weeks, I think. And you get a pail and they'll pick it up for a small charge. You can put anything in there. They take it to this huge anaerobic digester in like Southington. So you can put meat and bones and all sorts of things, plus obviously fruits and vegetables. It all gets, composted up, and then I think twice a year they will deliver compost to you for your garden, or you can choose to have it donated to a local farm or community garden.
Wow.
Blue Earth Compost. It's a great business. I had a membership when I lived in Hartford area, and I loved it. My sister, my parents are members, so I highly recommend it, because it's funny. We did a webinar and a green forum. We've covered the topic of environmental racism many times from many different perspectives. And one of the panelists, when I asked what is an issue that is an environmental justice issue that we might not think of, because we think of air pollution, asthma, and she said trash, plastic pollution, trash, and food waste. These things are incinerated or put in landfills in communities of color, urban communities. And so, for us to be conscious of that impact, we have to remember that, when we throw something away, there is no away.
Yeah.
So
that actually gets to something I was going to say really quickly, which is in the study we did where we looked at emissions from household food spending, we also looked at the emissions by household income levels, and we found that higher income households actually produce by far the highest sort of per capita emissions from food purchases. And that's in part because we know as people get wealthier, they spend more money on food. It's a smaller share of their budget, but it's in absolute terms more money, and it's kind of like everything else that you purchase. The more consumption you kind of engage in, the more environmental impact you're having. Even of course, there's better ways to consume than others, but overall, I think it's important to think about it from just like a pure consumption point of view. And like an income perspective.
Mm-hmm. Wait, someone just typed in another. Oh, so Kelly said, I like to talk about reducitarianism. I don't know what that is. So it's a website. I'm sure the people can see it in the chat, reducitarian.org. Yes, so it's in the chat. There's a website. I'm curious to click on it, but I'm going to wait. So thank you, Kelly, for that. So let's hear. Lauren wants to know, what are the next steps for researchers on the Lancet project specifically? And following up on another question, are you planning to incorporate seafood, both wild caught and aquaculture, into the assessment?
So I don't know. I should have said I was not part of Eat Lancet. So I'm not sure what the next steps are for their work. I hope they're doing more. And then what was the second question? It was about.
Oh, are you planning to incorporate seafood?
Oh,
into the assessment, both wild caught and aquaculture?
Yeah, I don't know. I think they should, or hopefully there are other scientists who are, planning to replicate their research. That would be great. But I think, in general, this area of research has gotten a lot more active in the last 5 years. So hopefully we'll see more studies. And we actually will have one coming out, hopefully in the next several months, looking at the interaction between cost and nutrition, because that's still heavily debated in some ways. So anyway, you might see that in the news.
Okay. We'll keep our eyes out. So Joy wants to know, on the chart you showed about various diets, it seemed like the vegetarian and vegan diets didn't improve land and water use. Do you know why this was?
That was... Yeah, it's so again, I think it goes back to the way in which we produce even a vegetarian diet. Like, it matters. It's not just about, it helps to, I think, to shift diets, but again, we need to have changes in agricultural production towards more sustainable practices, and like sort of holistic, not just reduce water use, but, increase biodiversity, reduce emissions. So it's a holistic shift, I think, in agricultural production that has to occur.
Well, and to your point, I think we've all read about the almond industry, and how like water intensive it is, and it's very bee intensive. The almond trees only flower for like a couple weeks a year, and so it's very much a monoculture, so they don't have pollinators, and so they ship in like all these bees all over the nation to pollinate these almond trees, and then the bees die en route. It's a problematic, but almonds, it's a nut, there's almond milk, it's a dairy, substitute, it's a huge business. And so, but it's definitely problematic. It's actually part of the reason I or EJN got into pollinator gardens and pollinators, is to sort of raise awareness about the importance of a diversified ecoculture for growing food and all the things that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's plenty of examples where even some of the greens and vegetables we buy, like, there's some really intensive hazardous chemicals that farm workers have to use. So there's also that part of it. It's not just environmental impacts, but it's also impacts on farm workers and things like that.
Right, exactly. And when a lot of times these are immigrant workers, and now they're much more likely to be exposed to COVID, it's justice, environmental justice and racial justice impact this on every level. And we're never far away from needing to consider that ever.
Absolutely.
It's always a key piece. And actually, Kelly just said reducitarianism, I like that, is eating less animal products, but not as strict as vegetarianism. To me, it's about eating consciously and not seeing meat versus no meat as a black or white issue. And yeah, I think that's good. And that website's in the chat for anyone who wants to check it out. So yeah, I agree. I think that it's a tough case to pitch to someone who eats meat maybe 2 out of the 3 meals a day, right, to say go vegetarian. But if you can encourage them to incorporate more vegetables into their life, they're, for one thing, hopefully going to be healthier.
Yeah, and then there's these meat, plant meats, which are becoming so popular. And I think I've got a friend who he's a big meat eater, and he's even into these. So, you know, and they have problems. I think there's concerns about sustainability. There's concerns about, well, that's not better for nutrition to swap a Big Mac beef burger with a Beyond Burger.
Right. It is a high level of fat in those things.
So it's, you know, it's complicated. And I think it speaks to what Lance had said on this slide, which is, you know, we have to have a really big transformation in how we're all doing this. So, and I think our little changes, modifications are really important to drive that larger change, because it is going to require policy and agriculture and food system actors and consumers. So,
right. Absolutely. So does anyone else have any other questions? We may have come to the end of our Q&A. I think we've answered them all. It was a good conversation.
Yeah.
I have to say, yep, looks like. Dr. Boehm, thank you so much for being with us. I'm like so grateful. This is super interesting, and I think a very important. Pam said, thank you so much, Rebecca and Terry. I very much enjoyed this presentation, and I'm glad to find out that I'm eating as a reducitarian and have been for a while. So, so yeah, no, and again, for anyone attending, this will be up on our YouTube channel, so you can review it again. And we have other webinars up on our YouTube channel. We just did one on intersectional environmentalism a few weeks ago. That's up there now. Yeah, we try and do a lot of different topics, a lot of food for thought. No pun intended. But anyway, again, thank you so much. This is amazing. And
vote, everyone vote, please.
Yes,
vote.
Everybody get out there and vote.
Yeah.
I'm going to start, got to do some phone banking for sure.
Yeah. So, all right. Thanks so much, Teresa.
Have a great night.
You too. Bye, everybody.
Bye.